All right, welcome to everyone joining us tonight. I know there was a lot of traffic, and I know it was difficult to get here. But thank you for joining us in the space, and those that are joining online, we welcome you as well. Turn down your volume on your devices, too. My name is Carl Dubman, and I'm the Dean of the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University. The event this evening is one way that we're working to constantly try and rethink how we do some of what we do. As a college, we're focused on design, technology, and practice. And this event is a perfect confluence of these three things. We're standing in a beautiful space and joined by incredible architects tonight. Craig and I met up this summer, and we started hatching up this plan as a way to try and innovate with thinking about a lecture series, or at least a lecture. I think for years we've talked about trying to do lectures as one building, where we might be able to unpack just one building in one lecture. So this is our opportunity to do that. We couldn't do this without our belief in and our amazing support from e-learning. They're working very hard behind the scenes. I think they got here at 2 o'clock this afternoon in order to get everything set up. And they make something like this possible, so we're incredibly thankful to them. So it's great to be in a space and be able to see the process and hear about the thoughts and motivations that went into this project. And as I mentioned this a little bit before, often there are students sitting in the lecture hall looking at your phones, and tonight we're actually encouraging you to do that as a way to see more. So in some ways, this is a kind of augmented reality lecture being in a space. I've known Craig and Jen for many years, and I'm so excited that they're willing to share this project and this gem of a building with us tonight. So a bit about them before we start tonight. Together, Craig Borum, Jen Maigret, and William Carpenter are Ply Plus, a collaborative architecture practice dedicated to design excellence. Ply Plus has developed an approach that combines rigorous research and creative invention. If you're not familiar with their work, you should be. And their practice is growing, and the scale of the work is growing with projects like this, and also including some large-scale projects that they're working on in China. Craig Borum received his FAIA this summer, and he's the founding principal of Ply in 1996. That same year, he also started teaching at the University of Michigan. Both Craig and Jen are great examples of people that both teach and practice. Ply's work has been recognized with the Progressive Architecture Award, 8 projects which have won Michigan AIA Design Awards across building and interior design categories. Additionally, designs have won an American Architecture Award from the Chicago Athenaeum, Wood Design Award from Wood Design and Building Magazine. Craig is also a recipient of the highly competitive Young Architects Prize from the Architecture League of New York. Their work has been featured in major publications in the US and internationally. Craig's degrees are from the University of Virginia, and I believe he was classmates with Dale. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Trained as an architect, both his undergrad and master's from UVA. Jen is also a licensed architect with a slightly different background, where she has degrees in, let's see where it starts. Masters of Architecture from the University of Michigan, a Masters of Science in Ecology, Evolutionary, and Biology. There was a funny word that preceded biology, from the University of Michigan, and a Bachelor of Art in Biology from Hartwick College. Both Craig and Jen are tenured at the University of Michigan, and their third partner is also here tonight, right? So with over 26 years of architectural experience, William Carpenter has worked on a wide range of project types, ranging from institutional to multi-tenant residential to large-scale retail developments. His project management experience ranges from zoological projects, parking decks, regional malls, senior housing, and retail planning. And a bit of a delay. I think William may also join in during the Q&A when we become more interactive. And I know that he's also on his way to Chicago this evening. So this is the strange part. Well, normally what I would say is I would welcome the lecturers, but it's strange to welcome them because it feels like we're in their space tonight. And so this kind of flips this on us. So I want to thank the PLY team for being such great sports and for taking this risk with us tonight on trying a new format and approach to a lecture. So let's kick this off and see if it works tonight. So welcome Craig and Jen and William.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's good to go.
What a pleasure to have everyone here tonight. It really has been very exciting to have the opportunity to take a short look back. We're going to give you a very brief history of how we got here tonight. It's been a very exciting and very fast ride. So we're going to start by giving you some context and then getting into some details. And Craig and I are going to take turns telling the story a little bit to try to make that part a little bit interactive as well. Let's see. Yours is still cycling. But is everybody seeing our slides? Did it change? Okay.
Okay. There we are. Anyway, as Carl said, we're a team of 3 partners in the practice now, but we're a much bigger team in terms of the scope of the project and the scope of the work that we're trying to undertake. And that next slide is really the people who are really making things happen for us. There's a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of people behind the project that work really hard to pull this off.
Has everybody seen our slides? Oh, it's that far delayed. Okay, so welcome.
Yeah. You're seeing. That's kind of what's on my phone too.
Okay.
So.
Well, let's turn yours off.
Now I see us.
I'm going to turn yours off because that'll be one more competitor.
Yep.
One less competitor.
So we won't know where you guys are now, but we were trying to monitor, but that's like more bandwidth, I guess, that we're losing.
Well, the images will catch up. We wanted to take an opportunity just to explain how this project originated. We were one of a small number of architecture firms invited to compete in an RFP. And one of the things that was really unusual and significant about this project right from the start was that the hospital had already engaged a group of community members that were already chapel participants in the old chapel, along with Father Gilbert Sanghera, who teaches at UD Mercy, to stage a vision statement. So the RFQ asked the applicants to address 4 different qualities. And I'm just going to read briefly the statement that we wrote in response before we really knew much about what our approach was, but just in response to the prompts. The first one was beacon. And we wrote, as the most visible expression of light and welcoming, the design of the chapel as beacon will be approached through a renewed investment in volumetric expression. Currently, the strong horizontal aspect of the volume of the chapel, the one that's next door, diminishes its capacity to act as a recognizable and distinct component of the hospital campus. We propose to transform these qualities of the chapel by removing and redesigning the roof and overall volume. That's what the original prompt was to redesign that space. And we'll employ the qualities of geometry, materiality, landscape, and light to achieve a more vertical and lighter expression of the chapel as beacon. The second prompt was prayerful environment, and the images that you'll see were images that we submitted as part of the RFQ. Eventually they'll catch up and you'll see some projects by Olafur Eliasson, some kind of...
They're on the first one now.
Okay, perfect. Artistic projects, that is a project that was a balloon that floated up in the city to provide kind of northern light as an emblem of light and verticality. The second prompt was about prayerful environment, and we showed some details of some prayer mats that his studio has worked on, and we wrote, prayerful environments provide protective spaces that enable individuals to suspend their connection to the stresses, routines, or circumstances of a given moment, and to mentally and emotionally connect to something beyond themselves. There are many physical attributes of constructed environments that provide perceptual experiences that enable this important transition from distraction to prayer. The third prompt was about healing spaces. And one of the other things that was unique about the RFP was that although the chapel was always at the heart of the project, it really was envisioned as a spiritual center that also included a reflection room, which is what you pass by to get here, and a Muslim prayer space, which we'll talk a bit about as well. And that all of those spaces were really at the heart of the mission of the hospital, that these were spaces that provided a kind of healing that went beyond what could be provided by medicine alone. So we wrote, healing spaces provide respite from the challenges of illness and allow individuals to recover optimism in the process of healing. For many, a connection with the sights or sounds of nature provides a space for healing. For others, experiencing beauty and quiet can nurture processes of healing. We propose to establish a protected outdoor landscape space that is physically connected to the chapel and allows individuals to move between the two spaces to seek their own personal experience that provides respite and nurtures healing. And we'll talk a little bit about that garden, which is a future project, which will happen outside these windows, hopefully soon. And the last is manipulation of light. The manipulation of light will serve as the most critical consideration of the project. Our ideas related to natural light, generous and indirect, will drive the geometric development of the new chapel volume and roof structure. The manipulation of natural light will also play an important role in helping differentiate distinct areas of sacred space that comprise the chapel, including the tabernacle or space of ablution. Both material selection and landscape sequence can contribute to these effects and augment larger visual impacts with the subtleties of weather, wind, and other natural phenomenon, and the movement of sun, clouds, or the changing colors of the seasons. So those were the first responses to the prompts before we really kind of delved into the project design in particular.
Right. And then, so what we're showing you are actually slides directly from the interview that we had with them on after the first submission of the RFP. And this was a slide that we showed, I think it's there now, the Borromini's San Carlo alla Quattrofontana, as well as San Lorenzo in Turin by Guarino Guarini. And we talked about these as the kind of role that geometry plays in the production of space and the importance of it. And part of what we were talking about too was the kind of role of a particular moment in church architecture of the Baroque, where the architecture was really given the task of trying to produce a sense of awe, a sense of wonder. And the architects who are working on that did that in pretty remarkable ways through the manipulation of sophisticated geometric systems, but also in ways that rendered things that were heavy as light. And particularly the Guarini that I think you're seeing on the screen right now is a massive dome, but it's rendered in a kind of lattice work that is pretty fascinating to us. So we're trying to think about like how the kind of qualities of light, the qualities of shaping of a space articulated the potential of a new kind of volume. And part of this was in response, I think after we're done, we can all walk to the old chapel and you can get a sense of the significance of why we were talking about a spatial volume in relationship to the proposed project. I'll also say that at the beginning, the prompt was not necessarily to do a new chapel. The RFP said that the project was open to both renovating the existing chapel or possibly a new chapel. So we were trying to calibrate our presentation relative to the possibility of renovation rather than just a new chapel.
And the other aspect of the work that we brought to the table when we were invited to interview was some research that we had already been engaged in related to dichroic glass, but in a very different context. So the images that I'll show in a moment are first a photograph from a series of samples that we received. We were working on a grant sponsored by Guardian Glass as part of work we were doing at the University of Michigan. And in the process of proposing a project related to glass, got a tour of their facilities, and the samples that you'll see are part of a glass sputter coating process, a little bit different than this glass, which is a laminated glass with a film in it. But one of the aspects of dichroic that we were really interested in was its capacity to both be reflective as well as transmissive for light. In that particular research project, we were looking at it as a potential material to produce essentially light well insertions in old elementary and public schools that needed renovation, and looking at that as a way to merge STEM education, so the growing of plants, with increased light and air ventilation. And one of the things that we learned about, or that we were trying to match up, was that for example, if you're doing a little greenhouse, plants don't use all of the visible spectrum of light. So we were developing recipes with Guardian to split the light in such a way that some of the wavelengths of light would be reflected to the plants, and then the other wavelengths would reflect out into the hallways of the typical double-loaded corridor typology.
As a way to manage heat gain and the UV effects of light.
Exactly. So, so we showed this work as part of it, and also said, you know, we thought that there was also exciting possibilities to use that as a reinterpretation of some of the qualities of color and light that were in the tradition of stained glass in chapels.
So I'm watching Carl's screen spin.
I know.
But the next slide is a slide that we, in the very first, after we got the job, which was kind of shocking and amazing and awesome. And I'll say again, the clients and the design team for the chapel, or for the hospital, was really amazing and really incredible to work with all the way through. And in fact, pushed us, I think, further than we might have felt like we would normally go in the process. But when the first thing that they asked us to do in the first meeting was to, before we met with them, was to analyze the grounds of the campus of the hospital, which is enormous, and identify where we thought locations would be for the chapel. And if you zoom out to an aerial on your phones of this area, it's mostly parking. It's almost entirely parking, except for the hospital itself. There's the spot where we are right now, of course, which we weren't really thinking about entirely as a first approach. There's another spot on the far side of the hospital on Levon, where the old emergency room is, that was a potential location. We had talked about the existing chapel, which is right next door, as a renovation site, but potential also the expansion of that. And so that's where this site was the kind of open space for that. But there were quite a few utilities in this area which we thought might preclude the budget that they had in terms of us for developing here. And then the final location that we proposed to them, which no one remembered until we dug this slide back up, and I met with the guys who, the design team this morning on another, one more room that we're working on, and I asked if anyone remembered that we proposed to put this on the roof. And Steve Van Brussel, who's the head of the construction, kind of the lead, our main consultant, said, "No, you didn't do that." I'm pretty sure you didn't do that. But anyway, we actually thought about the roof, which is kind of crazy.
So through the process, it looks like the slides are catching up. We did do a kind of some test fits, which we're not going to show here, but in the process of trying to work on the existing chapel as a site and reorganizing that to work with the new program, you can see the existing chapel is a triangular figure. It's got a bar of rooms on the back, which is where the priests
there's 2 apartments where the
have
priests
apartments,
live.
and but there was this additional program, and we were kind of working through that. And in the process, we just kind of tested shifting the volume over, and quickly realized that there were a number of advantages, but one of the big advantages was that there's a very special cross on the front face of the hospital that's up behind and above us right now. And one of the impacts by thinking about the massing in relationship to that part of the hospital not only shortened the circulation sequence, you all had the experience of walking by the cafeteria on your way here, one less hallway to go down, but it captured the cross. And so we basically started talking about the development of the massing as a way to borrow the cross and have that be a part of the chapel massing. And that really was the observation that sort of locked in this site as the site to work on.
Right. And then, as much as we were already interested in certain kind of geometrical operations, we were also dealing with that cross. We're dealing with the kind of flying buttress of this kind of porte cochere, which is only about 3 years old. So when we suggested that might need to go away, we were immediately corrected. There's There's a basement under the existing chapel, which the fire stair comes up right in this corner, which we were kind of pinched by, as we couldn't actually close that. We eventually ended up closing it for a short period of time, but it was a kind of negotiation between all of these kinds of pieces that are kind of pushing and pulling. And then there's the other kind of geometrical constraint of we're in the grid of Michigan, but Mecca is 53.6 degrees that way. So the Muslim prayer space also needed to have a kind of reorientation and kind of positioning on the site. So all of these pieces were kind of like pushing and pulling against the geometry of the building to the point where the shape started to just kind of form itself out of some of those maneuvers. And the fact that one of the things that we had presented to them is that even though that there is a distinction between the Catholic chapel space, which we're in, the Muslim prayer space, which actually can't see or hear each other for simultaneous services, the iconography of the Catholic space can't impinge upon the non-Abrahamic religions. And then the seeker space or the reflection room wanted to be connected, but also discrete and opposite, kind of isolated. But our position was that all of these needed to be kind of unified in the overall architectural move. So a lot of the kind of working of geometry, the curvatures, are about a kind of response to kind of wrapping these kind of discrete figures into a tighter bag.
And so the plan that you're looking at now shows one of the early kind of pre-schematic package plans, which has a secret space oriented more to the west, which was to be a healing garden, and the Muslim prayer space down to the kind of south east, and the chapel very similar actually to where we are now. And at that point, we had started to get on the inside. It was a really very rapid process,
Yeah.
which was also one of the things that was really significant to the development of the work. We had weekly meetings with the chapel design team. So every Monday morning, we had to show up with the next step of development. There was a lot of pressure to get the project done because Sister Mary Modesta, who is one of the original nuns, who's the foundress of this hospital, was still very much involved, and they were originally aiming to do this for a birthday November opening. And you know, even with all of that, the start to end of construction was around 19 months. So this development was happening very quickly, and so we were using representations like setting up just the tones in the digital model, that we weren't actually trying to do too many extra drawings as much as just show them the process work underway with tones and colors that could kind of clarify what we were working on. So some of the things I think you'll see are familiar. Some of these images show the development. We had very 3 or 4 iterations of garden walls for the healing garden. All of that is on hold for the moment. But a lot of the qualities of this chapel space were there from the very beginning, even in rough forms. And a lot of it was about refining those as we got more specific about material systems and space constraints.
Right. So the other thing that accelerated timeline at the beginning of meeting every Monday with a full new presentation of the design, it was end of March, April, and we had another major deadline for a project in China that we were doing, which our whole office was consumed with, and all of our go-to students at school were shredding on their final reviews. So really the first 8 weeks of the project was Jen and I still teaching full time, but really the only ones working on the project because we couldn't peel anybody else off of the other work that we had already committed. So it was a kind of insane kind of moment. And it's also why there's almost no renderings, because we just have never learned to do that. So we were inventing, in the time constraint, the kind of ways of presenting the work and kind of showing it. And then we got to the kind of point, I think right about the end of May, with a kind of fairly full developed schematic design. A full package, I think, was about 120-page submission of the schematic design package that was then handed over to the construction managers who were just hired at that point. And they did their first cost analysis. And it was a really interesting process, I'll say. So they're using a software called CostX, which basically takes your BIM model and kind of simply imports all the data from your BIM model to generate their cost estimate. Of course, we have a Rhino model, not a BIM model, and called AutoCAD files, not. So, you know, we did a lot to kind of work through with them because they'd kind of forgotten how to do actual takeoffs. So they scanned a PDF of our drawing, dropped it into their software, and began to make a schematic model. They misscaled the drawing that they imported to about a quarter larger
30% bigger
than it was. So we got the first numbers back from them, and of course it was absolutely wild and kind of shocking for everyone. It was like, it ended up being over like $1,500 a square foot in terms of the cost, which is, even for something that like what we were drawing and what the hospital was interested in, was a bit radical. And the interesting thing in the process of working with, what we're learning of working with builders is that that first number, like no matter how wrong it is still there. It's still a kind of number that's there. And as we were scaling back and kind of working and kind of making the corrections and the assumptions, you know, you don't ever get all of that money back. So we were always in this kind of, it felt like a kind of 6 weeks period of kind of battling and kind of working to kind of resolve the kind of questions between what for us was a kind of anxious to kind of move into the next phase where we're working with BIM, but we weren't quite there yet, and the design that we had developed really probably wasn't the one to learn it on in terms of like the workflow and the timeline and the accelerated schedule of the project. So we were kind of working in a pretty intense way back and forth with them. And at the point where we got their numbers kind of at least to the right square footages, we were still far enough over budget. And the slides you're looking at now are basically us then taking a kind of old Xerox trick of just shrinking reduction of the spaces without changing any of the overall qualities of spaces, to the point where we're still working to kind of get that budget down. And the last drawing, I think here, that might be about to show up, is pretty close to the scheme that you're seeing now in terms of the general location of pieces. So as part of that, the Muslim prayer space, which was independent and part of the new wing, became a renovated space down along the corridor. It was the nuns' dining room, their private dining room, which they gave over to the space. And we designed an ablution space as a kind of entry sequence to kind of set up that room.
And then reoriented that, wrapping originally with a screen to be fabricated, and now it's a combination of screen and curtain to reorient the otherwise rectangular room,
Right.
which is shown in yellow in the drawing that you're
Right.
looking at.
And then the other thing that immediately happens when the project goes over budget is they cut the garden. Landscape is like the first number that's kind of attacked. And so we ended up, there was a lot of sentiment to maintain that relationship between inside and outside. And so it became the courtyard that's adjacent to the reflected space around the corner. Yeah.
And so we just flipped through a few of the iterations of the plan. The yellow one was kind of leading up to schematic. The black and white was our SD, and now you'll see one that starts to have the tone and recognizable pews that you're all sitting in, and that's the current plan as we have it now. The other big part of the development was the corner, the kind of expressive corner of the building and of the chapel. The massing of this project, while the individuals' rooms were shifting, had always stayed pretty consistent in terms of the way Craig described as sort of smoothing over disparate uses and trying to make the beacon the singular element out of that. And so the transition of the corner from square to rounded at the top was there from very early on, although at the point of SD we were still sort of testing out various ideas of what material we might use to actually achieve that.
Yeah, we did. We're not showing these, but we did a scheme with precast concrete. It was determined by our construction managers that all of the precast concrete companies were so far backed up because of the Little Caesars Arena that we couldn't get on anyone's list, so that went away. We looked at GFRC as a series of cast panels at a different scale than the precast. That kind of got lost along the way somewhere, and then ultimately we settled on brick as a way to begin to work. And a couple of ways that we began to work between the kind of digital model, between a way of beginning to design the brick and think about the distortions in the geometry which were there as Jen said, from early on, and were interestingly like fought for by the design committee, because for them, like the curvature of the wall or the curvature of the kind of base of the chapel made it stand apart from the existing rectilinear box of the building. And they really didn't want this chapel to anyway blend in with the existing, even though we were trying to work contextually and borrow the cross and kind of develop it. They wanted, and we wanted it to be a kind of unique figure. And so the corner, this kind of important corner, is basically that corner. And it's the position of the tabernacle in the plan. And the interesting thing, and we'll talk about this again when we talking about the ceiling, but there's a tension between this space as a church. It's not a church, it's a chapel. It's designed for people to, I think that was actually me. It's designed for people to just come in at any time. There's a mass once a day, it's at 6 a.m. And the tabernacle, which is where the Eucharist is held, is used throughout the day by lay ministers who are taking the Eucharist to the sick who can't come down to the chapel for the Mass. And so that becomes for the nuns, that's more important than the altar, which is like the site of the ritual of the Mass. And so the tension between these two things sets up a kind of interesting kind of relationship in here. So we wanted that kind of verticality and height to grab there, and then it also gave us the opportunity to grab a little piece of southern light by pulling that corner further over to give us the dichroic window. But developing that corner, and we'll talk about the outside of it, because it's really a kind of, it was a tricky process both in the geometry of it, but also a really incredible and awesome experience of working with a group of unbelievably talented masons who were in it from day one. They saw the design and they completely were like, we want this job. They competitively bid it. It was a pretty great thing to get them on board. So the owner of the company and the head mason came to our office, and we're showing them the drawings, and they're looking at it, and they're scratching their heads, and they're not quite getting it. And then we pulled up that wooden model that you saw, which is about this tall, and it's every brick of that corner made out of basswood stacked up. And the head mason, their head guy, Mike Piazza, was just like, oh, we can totally do that, you know. And it was like this great moment where you're kind of like, you see the kind of the difficulty of what it's going to be, and then you see the kind of moment that's a challenge, and craftsmen kind of taking that on as a kind of way forward. And so we developed the drawings through a kind of back and forth dialogue with them about what we were after. So as we're wrapping the brick around the corner, it's conical, so every course of brick is a different length if you stretch the rows of brick out, because it goes from the right angle to a soft curve at the top. So every single course is different, and it all resolves at a straight line back here and a straight line up at the top of this window. And the decision was like, we don't want to cut any bricks at those moments, because we'll end up with some little slivers or some big fat joints. And so there's a whole process that we went through with them, both in our process of developing a grasshopper model that populated the wall of brick for us and worked on the angles, but then kind of going in and massaging specific areas in the model where we're expanding the mortar joint just a little bit to nudge it, or we're tightening the joint a little bit to kind of shrink it to get the final resolution point in line. And it was a really kind of remarkable moment, because it was one where the digital got us to a certain point, but it kind of wouldn't get us to that last hurdle. We had to go back in and start to begin to develop by hand through the kind of constraints and issues that we were putting on it.
And so the digital corner studies that you saw early on there, the color coding has to do with that. It has to do with coding the rotation of the bricks, and it also has to do with coding the different spacing layers of the joints of the brick. And the digital model was one of the things that we used to communicate back and forth with Davenport. We shared a model with them. They rebuilt their own digital model and shared it with us, and there was some kind of comparison and overlap there to see if everybody was using similar logics to build that corner.
And the basic premise that we brought to the development of this corner and the patterning of the brick was to simply let the brick happen. So as it turns the corner, we just said we'll delay the rotation of the brick just slightly. And so it's starting to pop out a little bit as it goes around the corner in Sawtooth. And then in the next course, we would do that in the opposite direction. So the brick starts to make a kind of brick weave in the pattern, but it's there just as a kind of result of the geometry interacting with the brick itself. And that was important for us because we wanted to articulate it as a presence on the facade, given how few windows there are, because it's such an internally oriented space, the kind of hospital chapel as a kind of inside, and only the couple of windows that would look to the garden, the dichroic window, and then a window to the east that in that morning mass brings light down onto the altar. The wall itself needed to have a kind of presence and character that was important.
And so one of the maybe even more challenging aspects of the corner had to do with the framing and the structure of the corner. Not necessarily just the steel structure underneath, but the secondary layer of studs as well to form the basis from which the masons would work, because there's also a tilt to it. So sort of measuring where you are in space on that corner becomes quite a bit of a challenge. So there was also a lot of back and forth process in terms of us sharing our models with the structural, the steel engineers, and then them sharing back. What you'll see in a moment is a kind of layering of those two models together, again, so that we could kind of see overlaps and see where things were or weren't lining up in order to coordinate that with the kind of models that the masons were working on.
So there are three drawings in that image. One is the Rhino model of our project, our Rhino model. There's a model that's imported from the steel fabricator from Douglas, who are just outside of Lansing, and then there's a CAD drawing of our wall section, all matching up to make sure that there's a kind of precision and alignment of all of those pieces. Because the last thing we wanted to do was get that frame up and then start bricking, and that piece of steel is kind of a little bit too far out, and now we got a whole another thing to worry about. And then this image is also, this is our skin and shell model with the steel model that was produced by Douglas inserted inside it. So we were looking at beginning to measure conflicts within the kind of resolution of these two pieces. And there you're starting to see now a sequence of images, which we'll just let kind of play a little bit, but this is a sequence of the construction of that corner from the steel frame to the steel studs, which are making the kind of larger surface as a ruled surface wrapping that corner, to the waterproofing and sheathing, to the insulation, and then you'll start to see some of the brickwork going into place. You'll get there in a second. We did a few quickly. The brickwork is, this was the other kind of amazing thing of working with Davenport's. We were ready to, we actually printed a number of full-scale, plotted some templates of some of the brick coursing, and thought that they thought at one point they would cut out some plywood molds, maybe every fifth or sixth course, and then they could reconcile in between. And in the end, they decided that they could Mike just felt like they could do it. And so what he developed was a method of running vertical strings, and those vertical strings are grabbing the point of each brick that's rotating. So the masons are really still placing by hand. They're working in a way that is calibrated and careful, but giving themselves, I think, a really interesting set of line work that they're beginning to develop. And then when we got to the larger corner, we had a Rhino model. We developed a model that they could import onto their iPads that they could turn off every layer of coursing. And so they were basically building the Rhino model one layer at a time as they're going up the course and kind of checking and working on that. And I think you're seeing an image of Mike with the iPad there on site. And then the corner is really interesting. So those vertical strings on this corner of the building under this window, they're all simply straight strings. When it gets to the conical corner, the joints and the points of the brick are actually starting to wrap around. So every day he would reset his strings. mapping that corner around. And they did a pretty amazing job, but the other challenge of that corner is that a lot of it has to do with just its direct visual impact. And it was a little bit frustrating both for them and for us, is that we couldn't see it during the process because they're built a scaffold up along it. So we're always getting these kind of small glimpses, and we're noticing points where it's a little too flat, like the strings are kind of a little not quite exactly right, so it's flattening out a little bit too quickly, or it's a little too peaked in places. And Mike was just like, go away, get out of here, we'll fix it. We'll come back and fix it, but we need to get to the top, and then we can pull the scaffold off and see it, and we can come back and start to make adjustments. And they did. It was totally amazing. So we sat out there. Taka was there every day while they were doing this corner. He was showing up on site, and they were working through it. We thought they were going to let Taka lay a few of the bricks, but in the end, they never did. But Taka, I think, really became a kind of mason through the project as well. And that corner kind of pulls off what we were after, which is like it starts to produce a kind of visual density right as it starts to round and model. And coupled with the kind of lower corner and the upper corner, it makes this kind of interesting dynamic across the facade that we were after. And you're seeing just some images of the final brickwork, or as it's finishing in process. The other thing that's really nice is I think it takes advantage of the iron spot brick, in that every angle of the brick is grabbing a little bit of a different angle of sunlight or reflection, and so over any moment of the surface, it's changing in its color and its reflectivity, and really beginning to produce some of the kind of atmospheric qualities that we were after.
Is everybody stuck right now, or some are cycling? Okay, that's cool. You guys are ahead of Carl.
Yeah, they put some scaffolding back up, and then they took out a couple of big sections and then just redid it within it. I mean, we were freaking out when we started to see that crease in the corner start to emerge, and then there's a little flat spot, and we're like, they're way past it already before we caught it, and it was just like, oh.
They fixed it. They were amazing. Yeah.
I got all of the gray is from the last 19 months.
From the brick.
And the door, which we'll finish on.
So we're going to take you to the inside from the outside, and recalibrate a little bit through a diagram that we started thinking about probably earlier in the schematic orientation and redevelopment of the plans. We really started thinking about how the different religions organize space and orientation. And so in the chapel, there's a very strong axis, and everybody's oriented along that axis. In the Muslim prayer space, it's more of a field of people oriented to one very particular angle. And we were also asked to deal with this reflection room, which is sort of what people are calling it now. For a while, a number of the nuns were really thinking of it as a seeker space, as a space for folks who maybe were in the Catholic faith and are no longer, or aren't sure yet. And so for us, we wanted to try to identify what its relationship would be also in terms of kind of orientation or relationship to something. So we conceptualized that space as a circle, that somebody would be in relationship to that garden that Craig mentioned before, or a tree or nature. And so the section that's coming up is showing a cut through the chapel that we are now, a little bit of the seeker space that's just behind us. And I'm just going to show very briefly those other two spaces, which we'll try to save enough time to visit. The Muslim prayer space is the space that probably changed the most through the process, both because of its relocation, but also simplification in some of the screening elements. So the ablution space is very much in line with where we started, and it's really the space that got the most investment in materials and detailing, because it's kind of the space of transition from one place, from working or being at the hospital, into the space of prayer. And by the time you're in the prayer space itself, you're less focused on the room as much as you're focused on the act of prayer. And so the image that you're showing originally was a kind of screen, a double layer of laser cut metal that was sort of interpreting and extending some Islamic tiling patterns with a gold layer behind and a white layer in front with the cut out as the Qibla wall. And so that center part is still intact in the room. The rest of it transitioned into fabric, into curtains in order to reorient that room. And then the seeker space always had an idea about shifting from the iron spot brick on the outside to something much more colorful and reflective and maybe interior oriented on the inside. And so we found a glazed brick that had a kind of bluish green tone to it, which really had a lot of resonance to people when we were showing them. A lot of different people from different faiths found that as a kind of reflective color. It just really resonated with people quickly. So a lot of the development of that room had to do with the development of colors and geometries one to the next. And the image is an older version of it that also went through a lot of different versions. The current format, which you'll see, really, this is before the outside of the chapel changed. And when it shifted, it gave us an opportunity to get the bench spaces much more in a kind of circular relationship with that courtyard. So it has a stronger visual relationship now than it did earlier on.
Yeah. So there's two things that are kind of small things, which you'll notice like when we go back outside and start to walk around a bit. There's a window into that space from the hallway. And the window it has a series of wooden louvers in it that allow you, as you're coming down the hallway, moving in this direction, to see through the space into the courtyard, but it shields from view anyone who might be sitting in that space. Because aside from it being a kind of seeker space, it was also described as being a place where a priest or a doctor or the hospital staff might be consoling specifically a family, delivering some news, talking over options. And so it had to also be a kind of protected and shielded space, but we also wanted to pull that light in all the way through to the hallway. And then the window that's kind of opposite us right now, that's facing the hallway as well, is really to protect the sound of, there's part of the education wing of the hospital that happens in the basement of the old chapel. And there's always a kind of run of traffic across there. And those wooden slats are actually all aiming your view right to the altar, right through. So they're kind of, they're much more subtle because they're almost straight on, but there's a kind of subtle shift that moves across. And then the glass is also repositioning in between those. And it actually cuts down on some of the reflectivity of seeing yourself as you walk through.
And so the ceiling was another important orienting device. And as Craig has already mentioned, the tabernacle holds the kind of highest position of importance in the sequence of the hospital. And so the ceiling allowed us to have two axes, the kind of main aisle axis, which is marked in the floor in the color of the terrazzo, related to the altar, and then the pitch and the seam in the ceiling pointing to the tabernacle. And so when you come in, you've got the two axes marked together. And so the diagram that's up was an early one developing two essentially cylinders, very large cylinders, and finding a way to intersect in order to get curvature out of linear elements. So all the wood slats are linear elements, and the curvature is attained through the ribbing, the structure that they're attached to.
There's a lot of work positioning the kind of overall geometry of those cylinders to produce the crease that goes from the tabernacle to this back corner as a diagonal opposition to the front axis of procession straight to the altar. So also it allowed the position of the slats in the ceiling, to make a ruled surface, but also to reorient slightly on their oblique so that you're not looking up between them as you're coming in. And then this one also had a lot of work to get to the point where the ruled surface was also parallel with this wall in order to resolve all of the geometries that are coming into play. And then the other one, the kind of far one, is oblique, and it's getting clipped everywhere. But it also returns, once it gets around that corner, back up over the oblique window. So there was a lot that was going on in here that for us was, I hate to say that anything like that, it was like we were channeling the Baroque, but we were definitely thinking all the way through that through the kind of inspiration of some of those spaces that I showed at the beginning, that the insides and the outsides would not have to match, that kind of idea that the outside is beginning to bundle things. But there's also a kind of program of sculpting that happens, both the sculpting of the ceiling and the sculpting of the walls, from the niches that define the Stations of the Cross to the geometries inscribed on the floor that define each of the main liturgical spaces at the front, from the speaker space, from the presider's chairs, the altar, and the tabernacle itself. And those get inscribed in the surface of the floor. And then the wall is kind of resolving between a kind of regular kind of geometry as it has to kind of come together with the ceiling and sculpting that space in between. So these are all also kind of developed out of a ruled surface that's actually made out of a company in Michigan that has figured out a top secret patented method of curving drywall, which they won't explain. But basically, he came to the office and we're trying to explain to him what he knows. Give me any shape, as long as you can make it out of a piece of paper, I can do it. We're like, okay. Challenge accepted.
And he made it.
And he did it.
So the images that you saw were a study model that we did. That was a very important model for getting the actual ceiling fabricators on board with the project, and also understanding what we were trying to do, which is very difficult to show in any kind of 2D or really even 3D models. And then the image, the final image of the ceiling is the kind of test bending of the framework to establish those curvatures and geometries at the fabricator's shop.
Yeah, Jasmine Construction did the installation of the ceiling, and they built the ceiling in their shop before they brought it here. It was a pretty incredible thing. So a couple of other kind of special pieces that are inside here. One is the altar, which when we got the project, we were also given the papal missal defining the elements of the church that had to be met. And one of them is that the altar should be of stone. Although there is a footnoted exception that in North America it could be of wood, but we decided not to read. We never read the footnotes. We just like read the body of the text. And so we said, well, let's make it out of stone. And we did a number of sketches that were trying to work off of the geometry of the church that we'd already established, the conical corner, where lines always go from, as they move in section, they go from right angles to curvature. And so the altar really began to play out that as a series of operations that we generated digitally, and then enlisted the expert help of Quarrystone, who are totally amazing. And they basically, we thought we were going to build this up out of a bunch of pieces. It would be assembled in space, and they're like, we'll do that out of one piece. That's so easy. Thanks, Lucy. But it was an incredible experience working with them. And we, once we had the kind of model developed, we presented to the design committee as well as the budget, and they didn't blink. They were like totally fine. And then we'd also designed the two other critical pieces up here, the ambo, which is the podium, and the tabernacle base. And at that time, we had designed this entirely out of wood, and that out of actually a set of steel ribs that were to support the tabernacle. And it was decided that they didn't like the steel. They thought it was too cold. So what do we do? So we said, well, why don't we think about the altar as a kind of as a kind of family of pieces, and we developed the geometries that has to have a small table where you can take things out and set it to the side, so the kind of lip that's peeling out. And then we still had this all out of wood, and Father Gilbert basically said, the relationship is actually much stronger between the altar and the ambo. This is the body of Christ and the word of Christ, and the tabernacle is actually a separate thing, because once you're here, there's nothing there. So I said, okay, well, we could make that out of stone too, I guess. And so we did.
And so then I had the pleasure of visiting the quarry to help pick out the stone, which was a really amazing trip, both to see the facilities at Cora Stone and to work with them directly on some of the finishing details in terms of honing and finishing the surfaces of the different pieces. So the images that I think that you see now is the site of the quarry that all of this came from. We had some stone samples that were sent to us early on, which allowed us to gain approval and select the quality of stone that we wanted. And we picked a dolomitic limestone with a kind of grayish tone. It picks up a lot of the warm tones too, and took that little sample out to the quarry with me and worked with the folks at Cora to kind of walk through the edge of the water very carefully to get to the site of the stone and select things there. And one of the members from the hospital design committee came on that trip as well to kind of approve the slabs that were selected for the carving. And then the images that you'll see coming up are some images of in process. You'll see that the altar was carved upside down, kind of carving out the belly of the altar. And then one of the things that was really amazing to see at Cora Stone is that while they've got amazing robotic facilities, they also have master stone craftsmen, and all of these are hybrids between that. They go through both processes. These are not just digital outcomes, but really require the expertise of people who work with stone with their hands to get the final finishes as well. Right. And I don't know if this will work or not. We're going to try to show a video of Cora setting the altar. So we're going to, it looks like it's running. Yeah. Really blow the bandwidth with these, but right. So far so good. Yep. And you know, we had dinner with these guys at the end of the day, and the kind of stories about, or the knowledge of placing the foam pieces, the soft pieces on here as not to blow out any of these very beautifully sharp edges was a real skill as well. So it wasn't just the fabricators and the stones craftsmen, but the folks that got these here and set them were all incredibly knowledgeable about stone and how to work with it.
There's once Jen went out and did the stone selection, and then once the stone was in process, the fabrication was going, I took the office out for a kind of all-day lunch and learn, and we saw the pieces in progress. And one of the things that had happened is the original cutting of this piece, the bit on the robot exploded, and it jumped and it knocked the huge corner off of it. So this is actually the second one, and the first one became a kind of test piece, and it was in process, and the tooling on it was really beautiful, particularly at the edges. And afterwards, come up and take a look. But we decided to, in the final one, even leave the tooling on the edge of the curve where it starts to come in, and then we decided not to finish in any kind of fine way the interior of the ambo, and you can see the stepping of the tooling on it. But the curvature becomes something that we thought that this was the one piece where anyone could come, and you probably stand and you have the tendency of wanting to kind of grab hold of something that you'd feel the tooling right at that moment, and then the smooth on this side.
So 2 more elements to go. Briefly, the dichroic, back to the dichroic. As Craig already mentioned, we stole a little bit of a southern corner over there so we could really get some direct sunlight into the space, and specifically direct sunlight through the dichroic, because that's when it's its most spectacular. You get some of the sense of its really magical qualities even at night, because you can it looks like a mirror sometimes, and it still looks like glass, and it has this capacity of duality that's quite beautiful. But the development of that window was set by the challenge that even though we had worked with Guardian on the sputter coating process, those processes were not yet commercially available, so we had to work with films. These are 3M films. And at the moment, they only come in 2 colors, even though each one has a bunch of colors that it produces. So what we did is we looked at, we went old school and drew sections and sun angles for the summer and the winter. and started working on the angles of the different pieces of the two colors. And so in the diagram, one of the two is represented in the orange and the other in the kind of green tone that you'll see. And the goal was to orient them related to each other and at angles such that in both the summer and the winter there would be sun penetrating both a combination of the two colors as well as both colors independently to try to produce more color out of the two films that were available. And this was a really challenging thing to represent or to even know how to study because it is so reliant on sunlight to really see those qualities. So we struggled with it for a while trying to render it or trying to show it in 2D. But it's really its most spectacular when you can see it in person. And so in the process of the kind of fundraising and so on, they asked for the drawings and the renderings, and there was just no way. So we just sent the renderings with some samples so that people could hold the samples and just look at them and understand what the capacity might be, which worked really well. It ended up that a nurses group sponsored this in honor of a colleague of theirs who passed away during the process of the chapel. So this is now a kind of piece in honor of a nurse who dedicated her career here at the hospital. The images are showing some from the inside, some from the outside. We tried to keep the detailing quite minimal, so these glasses are gravity set. They're not held in a mechanical or any kind of siliconed way. We did have to go through the punch list and ask them not to use blue foam pieces at the bottom of all the plate because even with the spectacular dichroic that was showing, so that was the only real detail that this had. And the first day we showed up, there was like blue and black and white and red, and said, can we just do white? Right. So all of that is resolved now. But the image on the right shows really one of the first days where the sun kind of fully came out after it was installed, which was really exciting. The first week or two that it was installed, it was kind of cloudy and it was sort of glowing purple, and we thought, oh, we hope it has more color than purple after all of that. And then the sun came out and it was really spacebar.
Nope.
Oh.
Nope. Shit.
I'm going to try the video. This one's not working. Here we go. And so we also have a time-lapse video that hopefully will load. Here we
When
go.
Jen says that it was kind of glowing purple it was really probably the first month that it was installed, and we were all a little bit disappointed. But we also hadn't calibrated the fact with all of our meetings and site visits were early in the morning here through the whole project. And of course the sun is over here, not on it. And so it's just getting indirect light. And then one of the design committee members came and sent us a photograph at like 2 in the afternoon, and the explosion of the kind of reflectivity on the curvature and on the tabernacle was amazing. We just had never calibrated the fact that we hadn't been there when the sun was actually on the window. So what you're seeing now is a time lapse that was shot about 2 weeks ago, maybe a week ago, that was during a fairly sunny day, but there was a lot of cloud movement. So you're seeing the kind of the pattern of that cloud move across. But probably from about 12:30 or 11:30 to probably about 4:30 in the afternoon, where that movement is occurring. And then you're probably getting tired. The last thing we wanted to talk about was actually the door that's in motion right now. And when I said there's a lot of gray hairs that came out of this project, this was one of them. So this was something that we always had in the design pretty much from day one, this kind of idea of a grand door. And Father Gilbert, who was the liturgical space consultant for the hospital, was, I think every meeting we talked about the door, referencing the cast bronze doors at the LA Cathedral in Maneo's project. And so we immediately looked those up. They were $3 million when it was done, just for the doors. And we're like, yeah, probably not doing bronze.
The doors were the same budget we had for this whole project.
Right. So we went through a number of iterations and had some struggles, both with getting a fabricator to kind of be willing to take it on for anything reasonable. And there was even a moment when we had explored, we had talked to Cora about carving the door out of the stone but trying to use it in a different stone to try to get it thin enough where we might get some light through it. And it set off an unbelievable flurry of emails from Lincoln and the guys at CoAD who were like, this is a research project, we could do this. They were sending us like historic doors, stone doors, like giant pivot stone hinges. We were like, and we were so into it, and they were like, yeah, I'm pretty sure we could do it for your budget, and we presented it to the design meeting, and they were like, a stone door? You mean like a mausoleum? And the air in the room just went, so but we like our door. The stone is another project that we're still going to try to work on. But the door, so we worked with actually a couple who are graduates of your program and graduates of our program, Synecdoche Design, Adam Smith and Lisa Sauvé, and they did the fabrication for us. A couple of hiccups in this whole process. So interior swinging doors to meet ADA accessibility need to operate with no more than 5 pounds of force. We had found the hinge manufacturer who decided they couldn't guarantee that it was going to move for that force, given the weight of the door and the strange kind of design, which they couldn't quite calibrate. We went around and around and around, and then finally found a loophole in the door of the. It's a rotating door, not a standard pivoting interior or swinging interior door. It doesn't have it has a closer built into the hinge. And I forgot what the other loophole was, but we got the Randy Abramson at the city of Livonia is like, no problem. It's no problem. Like, but it is the exit door for the chapel. It's like one of the two. It swings, right? Like, yes, it does. He approved it. So we moved forward. What you'll notice now is you can probably operate that door by just blowing on it. It is so soft in terms of its movement. But the number of nights of kind of sweat of dealing with this company in the Netherlands who decided they didn't want to return our calls to tell us the kind of weight of the door or what we could do to the door, how we could reduce its weight to get the action to work. In the end, it turned out pretty fantastic. And the intent of the design was twofold. One, we wanted a kind of major and minor part of it, so the asymmetrical pivot was also a kind of challenge for them. But the other thing, we wanted the door to begin to set up some of the language of the ceiling. And then we used a different wood there. It's walnut, which picks up all of the elements that are up here in the front. So the top of the ambo and the cap for the tabernacle are also walnut, while everything else is cherry. And then we wanted a kind of really nice handle. And so the kind of leather wrap on the steel that goes up and down is important. The other thing that we wanted to do was, as the door moves, produce a kind of dynamism of effect. So the slats actually get thicker as they get to the horizontal member of the embedded cross. And so when they move, the gap of light in between starts to shift and change. And so there's a kind of moire, essentially, that starts to emerge in the movement of the door. Huh? Jen did a second ago, but
I think we're on the closing slide,
Yeah.
so we can set everyone free. But the closing slide, which I'll leave it on, is just another reminder and nod to all of the people who worked really hard on this project.
Yeah.
And were part of this broader team, not just Ply Plus, but liturgical space support and structures and engineers and all the way through. So we'll just leave that up so you can see the list of companies and individuals who came together to help make this happen.
Right.
So thank you very much. We're going to invite Bill to help us with questions or wandering around and taking a look at things more closely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
The one thing Craig neglected to acknowledge with the door is that door was mostly fabricated by the time we realized that the hinge went out.
Oh, that's true.
It's true.
So we thought it was going to be the garage door for a while.
That is true. It was pretty much done. I'm sure there's many other things you could correct in there.
It's important to note, though, that that door was pretty much built,
Yeah.
sitting in the shop.
Any questions? Or we can do questions on the round as well.
Right.
Anybody else?
I'll look first. You didn't speak about that. I guess this is the east-facing window.
Yeah.
I was wondering the strategy behind that. We talked a lot about the south-facing one.
You might be able to see it tonight. The east facing was a way to bring in light for the early morning mass because that's the only moment that has a very specific schedule and timing to it. And so in some ways, this is really the window for all of the chapel attendees who've been coming here for years. And I don't know that the color shows very darkly, but the ceiling of it is painted a very, very light blue as a Marian color because it also had the significance related to the direction and Marian imagery. So it's got a little bit of the kind of cool tones of the morning, and so it picks up the Mary part of the St. Mary's Chapel as well.
Beautiful work. Thanks for sharing it with us. There was some references you gave classically, and then some references I'm sure that your design committee came to you with, Moneo's LA Church as one. But there's one, and I just sort of picked up on this today, that I might be asking you if it is a source, but Elil Saarinen Columbus, Indiana, first Christian church, where the southern light that glows up on the altar, is that, and then the vertical windows, were you guys looking at that as a reference, or is that something I'm just picking up out of the air?
It wasn't something we looked at. I've been there, but probably 25 years ago.
And what
30
other
years ago.
references, was my other question, what other people or other works were you looking at?
We didn't study that one in particular. We were looking at some of Alto's work, and just in terms of how to resolve the ceiling. So I think the broader answer is that we were looking at a range of projects that weren't all necessarily chapels along the way.
Sure.
To try to figure out geometric relationships, or trying to figure out ideas about how light and geometry, this corner, we couldn't be sure. And for the most part, it does kind of hold the light of the dichroic window along that. So it's hard to say specific projects, also because it was happening so quickly. But it does feel very much like one of those things where when you're moving so quickly, you're sort of remembering things that you've looked at or studied, maybe even sometimes a long time ago, and working them through the process of development.
Yeah.
We didn't do like formal case studies per se. We were just kind of constantly looking for ideas and help figuring out the things we were struggling with.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. It was interesting, the committee told us that this is not the first time that the hospital has undertaken the idea that they needed to upgrade that chapel. And we were told about a previous exercise that they went through where the architects, which I don't think they ever even told us who they were bringing in lots of pictures and lots of images and trying to develop a kind of palette of things. And the committee actually decided that that wasn't so helpful for them, that what they were more interested in kind of relationships than they were kind of existing projects. And so I think we kind of downplayed that a little bit when we were talking to them, except for some of the things which were kind of obvious in terms of their inspiration, like the Baroque, in terms of our thinking, but ones that obviously they weren't imagining that that's what we were going to give them as a particular look. So it was an interesting process, and Father Gilbert teaches architecture studio at UD Mercy, and he kind of led that committee through an educational process before we ever got to meet them. So they were pretty astute and pretty sharp in terms of what they were asking for from us, and what they were trying to, I guess, kind of lead us toward, but not they kind of were kind of pushing us away from giving them kind of really specific images to respond to in that way.
Yeah, just a group of terrific design critics, just through conversation. And that's where those weekly meetings were essential to what this project is, just constantly working through and talking about what it was becoming.
It was, I mean, those meetings, I would say another thing that we learned, because we also got really tired of those meetings at a certain point, because it was like every Monday, and it was Monday, so that meant Sunday. It was like your weekend was gone, and it was exhausting. But what we realized when it came down to those moments when decisions had to be made about what we could do and what we couldn't afford to do and how we might change something, the committee understood the importance of the whole thing. They kind of got the design because they'd kind of lived it with us. It wasn't like, oh, here's a box, you know, what do you think? They'd kind of, I think they had ownership in it all the way through. And so the couple of moments when they stood up for the budget or they stood up for that's not the thing that you can cut was totally amazing. And so we're now trying to do that with projects as we've moved forward. It's kind of difficult as it can be, but we're trying now to, particularly through that early design phase of like really quick, regular meetings where they're seeing it almost in animation kind of develop rather than here's a finished thing.
Yeah, this ceiling might have been a drop ceiling.
You may have just answered my question in that last slide, but maybe you have a little more to add. I just wanted to ask a question about the relationship between geometry and cost.
Bill, you want to talk about this one?
I think what you said probably, just about the working through the process might be part of that answer, but as I look around, there's hardly a flat surface in this space. It's
Over there.
the floor. But how did you negotiate when there was pushback about budget or cost to be able to maintain some of the more complex geometries and avoid?
You want to take that first step?
Sure.
You need a mic.
Oh, here.
Maintain
Okay. Do we have one here?
Not for sound.
I don't know if it's the same or if that's the.
So the perception is geometry is expensive. And we fought tooth and nail. It was almost a running joke that if we didn't fight, that this would just be a square box with some punch windows in it. That's what every contractor generally wants to do. So having a client that understood what we're trying to accomplish. And I think the rigors of the digital modeling kind of demystified some of the complexities. There's some great examples with the brick where the way the contractor priced it, there were sort of 4 pricing categories. There was the regular speed, the slow speed, the specialty slow speed, and it's going to take forever to do it speed. And so working back and forth with the masons, we were able to sort of limit the areas of the super complex. And it really kind of did demystify some of those complexities. And in actuality, the brick came in 30% under budget from the initial. And in spite of all its complexities. So I think the key is that we have to work with the guys that are going to do the work. And if we get that opportunity to sit down with them and explain how it's actually happening, then they bring their creativity to the table and take it the rest of the distance. We played a game quite frequently. We called it Spin the Model, where we'd come in with a digital model and put it up on a screen and get the subtrades that are going to be doing the work and show them exactly what the rationale is and the whys. And assume, like the ceiling, the complexity of the ceiling, if you can imagine, where do you start? How do you lay one of these out to be able to give a reference for the second one? So once they understood where those points were, they said, oh, this is easy, we can do this. And so that's how complex geometries can be affordable, more affordable.
There were subtle changes too that we went through a series of testing with spacing. So this is more open than we originally wanted it. So there was a lot of kind of subtle changes that we did make and things that we gave up in order to kind of keep the larger element in place. A lot of simplifications, but probably some of them also benefiting the project. The engineering, the value engineering process, there were some hard-fought battles, but there were also outcomes that made the project better in the end.
So a typical design bid build model seems like it would not work well for what you're talking about, because you wouldn't have those conversations. Was this project done differently, or how, just to be able to
Uh,
have
It was construction manager, like running it. So it was, they had the job. They had pre-construction services as part of their contract. So working with us all that way through, they were compensated, and they were bringing the trades to us. Sometimes we were sneaking around them to get to the trades in a couple of places, but for the most part, yeah, it might have been very different as a traditional, bid, build, bid, design, bid, build.
Yeah, the danger in that delivery system is you don't know what the cost is until after you're way down the rabbit hole with the design.
Right.
So I want to thank you guys.
Oh,
I want you to move away from there so I can feel and repeat that thing.
okay.
But I'm sure the noise that you guys are hearing outside is the rain that's coming down, so you
Yeah.
might want to hang out for a few minutes, and I'm sure these guys would be happy to point out things, or if you were looking around and like, why is this like this, or I like this. You guys would like to hear,
Sure.
I like this,
Sure.
right? So if there's a detail that you really enjoy, or there's something that you're not sure how it works and why it's the way it is, I'm sure these guys would hang out for a few more minutes, and we can at least wait for the rain to finish. So we'd love your feedback on how you guys thought this format went tonight.
Yeah, how'd that go?
You can do that. You can send that to me. And I just want to again thank these guys for taking a risk with us tonight and sharing this amazing project with us. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's such an amazing thing. Thank you guys. Like Carl said, he and I have talked forever about like a lecture series that was just architects presenting one building. I got kicked off. I got kicked off of our lecture exhibitions committee because that was my broken record. But it was. Thanks. Thanks for having us. Yes. Yes.